the sound of rain falling on helmets, the crackle of static from a broken field radio. Somewhere in the fog, boots trudge through mud so deep it swallows sound itself. The year is 1944, Normandy. A German corporal walks alone through a shattered orchard near Bayeux. He is trembling, not from cold but from disbelief. All around him the countryside smolders. Barns burning, trees split by shellfire, the air thick with cordite and rot. He carries a white bedsheet tied to his rifle. Behind him 20 men follow. Ghosts in worn field gray, eyes hollow, rifles slung low. Ahead of them stand 5 Allied soldiers. Mud-caked, motionless, guns raised, no one speaks. The corporal steps forward and drops his rifle. The sheet flutters into the mud. He looks up and says, in perfect English, "We have no division anymore." For a moment, even the war holds its breath. Those 5 men, soaked and shivering in a forgotten orchard, have just taken the surrender of what was once one of Hitler's most feared formations, the 352nd Infantry Division. And no one in Allied command will believe it happened. They called it a phantom division. Not because it didn't exist, but because, by the end, it existed only in reports, in rumor, and in the fear of men who had already stopped fighting. The 352nd Infantry Division had been forged in 1943, drawn from veterans of the Eastern Front and new recruits barely 18. Its commander, General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, was one of the Wehrmacht's most hard-bitten tacticians, a soldier who had survived the carnage of Sevastopol and Stalingrad and carried the scars to prove it. His men were trained in the rolling fields of Brittany, drilled relentlessly, molded into a defensive wall meant to hold forever. By spring of 1944, that wall had been planted directly behind the Norman coastline, Omaha Beach. Kreis's orders were clear: hold the Atlantic Wall, stop the invasion at the shore. There is no retreat. They were dug in, confident, invisible, thousands of mines, bunkers buried under concrete thick as armor, MG-42s zeroed to the meter. They believed, as all soldiers must, that they were ready. Then the sea turned black with ships. It began before dawn, June 6, 1944. For the 302nd, the horizon wasn't water. It was a moving wall of steel, Allied landing craft stretching to infinity, blotting out the sea. The division's artillery officer, Major Werner Pluskat, stood in his observation bunker outside Colleville-sur-Mer and stared through his rangefinder, speechless. "Mein Gott," he whispered. "They're coming." He shouted coordinates, but the radio crackled with chaos, overlapping voices, panicked commands, screams. Allied naval guns opened fire. The earth convulsed. At 06:30, the first wave of Americans hit the beach. The 352nd unleashed everything. Mortars screamed. MG-42s shredded sand and men alike. For hours, the beach was a slaughterhouse. The 29th and 1st U.S. Infantry pinned against the surf, bodies piling at the tide line. Kreis believed the attack would collapse, but it didn't. By noon, the Americans had punched through. They climbed the bluffs, their bayonets glinting in sunlight filtered through smoke. German strongpoints fell one by one. Entire platoons vanished. Radio contact broke apart. When dusk came, the 352nd had already lost half its strength, and yet, the order came: counterattack. Kreis gathered what remained of his reserves and threw them forward in the dark. The night echoed with small arms fire and the dull thunder of distant ships. He didn't sleep. None of them did. At dawn, he saw the truth. His once proud division had been cut in two, scattered like dust across the bocage. The Germans had no air cover, no reinforcements, no fuel. They were surrounded by hedgerows that turned every field into a killing ground. Every day, more Allied units landed, their tanks crawling inland like armored insects. The 352nd fought anyway. In June, they were 12,000 strong. By mid-July, fewer than 3,000 remained. Survivors described those weeks as living inside a nightmare made of mud and echoes. The hedgerows were their tombs. A man could walk 10 meters and vanish forever. The air stank of wet earth and blood. Flies swarmed around unburied dead. The ground itself seemed to pulse with gunfire. One corporal later wrote in his diary, "We no longer fear death. We fear sleep, because when we wake, fewer are left." The division's morale collapsed quietly. Men began to disappear, slipping away at night, abandoning posts, leaving rifles propped in corners. Others began to hallucinate under constant shelling. They spoke of hearing whispers in the trees, voices of comrades long dead, calling them home. The Americans began calling them the ghosts of Omaha. By late July, Chryse was dead, killed by Allied artillery near St. Lo. The 352nd had no commander, no coordination, only fragments of men holding lines that no longer existed. In the chaos of Operation Cobra, when the Allies broke through the hedgerows, the remnants of the division were trapped near Tessy-sur-Vire. Surrounded, starving, cut off from supply, they hid among the ruins of barns and orchards. Out of 12,000, barely 700 remained armed. They scavenged food from dead cows. Ammunition was counted in single rounds. Some fought with captured American weapons, others with shovels and bayonets. When the final barrage came, it wasn't a battle. It was an ending. At 4 a.m. on August 1st, a mist rolled through the valley. In that fog, a handful of survivors made a choice that would shatter German command logic. They decided not to die for orders that no longer existed. A sergeant named Hans Bruckner gathered 20 men from different regiments. "If we stay, we die," he said. "If we go, we live." They tied a white bedsheet to a rifle and walked toward the gunfire. Every step was an act of rebellion. They expected to be shot, by their own side or the enemy's. But instead, when they emerged from the fog, the 5 Americans in that orchard simply lowered their weapons, eyes wide. No one spoke. No one moved. The war paused long enough for ghosts to surrender. When the report reached Allied headquarters, disbelief turned to suspicion. How could 20 prisoners claim to represent an entire division? Military intelligence sent officers to verify. They found fields littered with abandoned guns, documents, maps, and bodies wearing the insignia of the 352nd. The division hadn't been defeated in combat. It had disintegrated. No final stand, no last charge, just men fading into the mist, their will consumed by exhaustion and silence. The 352nd Infantry Division ceased to exist not because it was destroyed, but because it stopped believing it existed. That was its true surrender. When Allied commanders examined the records later, one note stood out and scribbled in pencil on a captured German map. "We are ghosts now. Tell them we fought until we vanished." That note sits today in a museum in Normandy, framed under glass. The handwriting is barely legible, a trembling script carved into paper like confession. No one knows who wrote it. But historians agree. Those 20 men who walked out of the fog that morning did not surrender an army. They buried one. And in doing so, they ended one of the last illusions of Nazi invincibility. When the telegram reached the 1st U.S. Army headquarters near St. Lo, the duty clerk thought it was a prank. He read it twice, then a third time. 20 German soldiers, they claim represent entire 352nd Infantry Division, surrendered under white flag east of Bayeux. The clerk stared at the page, then muttered, "They mean company, not division." But the report was signed by a field intelligence officer, Captain John Merrill, whose reputation for precision was known across the Corps. Merrill did not exaggerate. By noon, his field report lay on General Omar Bradley's desk. The words "no coherent enemy command structure remains" made the room fall silent. If true, one of the key divisions defending Normandy had simply ceased to function. That was impossible. Bradley dispatched a liaison team under Major Harold Longworth to confirm. They arrived at the orchard where the surrender had taken place. The mist still clung to the fields. The air smelled of wet hay and diesel. The American guards looked shaken, not triumphant. "They just walked out," one of them said quietly. "Didn't even raise their hands." They looked empty. The prisoners sat in a barn wrapped in blankets. They didn't speak, didn't look up. Their faces were gray, not from dirt, but from exhaustion that seemed to reach the bone. Longworth approached the corporal who'd carried the white flag. The man's name was Hans Bruckner, 23 years old, from Hamburg. He'd once been a school teacher. His eyes were lifeless yet polite. "Where is your commanding officer?" Longworth asked. Bruckner blinked slowly. "Dead. Who replaced him?" "No one." "Where are the rest of your men?" Bruckner hesitated, then said, "Everywhere, nowhere, the forest keeps them." Longworth frowned. "You mean they deserted?" Bruckner shook his head. "They just stopped." For 2 hours the Americans questioned him. Each answer deepened the mystery. The corporal insisted that when his platoon decided to surrender, the 352nd no longer existed as a unit. Orders had stopped days earlier. Radios were dead. Battalion headquarters abandoned. Men roamed the countryside in twos and threes, hiding from both sides. Some still fight, Bruckner said softly, but they fight ghosts. They shoot at echoes in the trees. When asked how many remained, he whispered, "None who remember being soldiers." The interpreter looked up, uneasy. "Sir, I think he means it literally." Allied intelligence compiled the testimonies into a preliminary assessment titled Collapse of Enemy Formation 352 Inf Div. The conclusions bordered on the absurd that sustained bombardment, disconnection, and psychological collapse had reduced a division to fragments without formal defeat. Psychiatrists called it unit disintegration, a rare phenomenon where cohesion dissolves before combat capacity is fully lost. But the scope was unprecedented. An entire division, 10,000 men, might evaporating into the hedgerows. General Bradley read the report in silence, then told his aide, "Don't circulate this. If Eisenhower sees it, he'll think we've gone superstitious." Still, copies spread quietly through command channels, reaching British 2nd Army HQ. One margin note scrawled by a British officer summed up the sentiment: a phantom defeat. Perhaps the war itself is consuming its own soldiers. Across the lines, German high command refused to believe the division was gone. Reports from Paris claimed the 352nd had merely redeployed east. Goebbels' propaganda broadcasts continued to praise their heroic resistance. In reality, no such resistance remained. The German staff in Rennes sent couriers to locate the division. None returned. Intercepted radio transmissions from stragglers were incoherent. Garbled code words, desperate requests for ammunition, coordinates that led to empty villages. One signal caught by Allied decrypt teams simply repeated the phrase, "We're in Schatten, we are shadows." For the next week, Longworth's team combed the countryside. They found abandoned field kitchens, smashed typewriters, crates of rations half buried in mud. In a farmhouse near Villers-Bocage, they discovered a field diary belonging to Lieutenant Otto Gerber. The last entry was dated July 30th. "The hedgerows are full of eyes. I hear breathing where no one stands. Orders come from nowhere. Perhaps we are already dead." Longworth closed the book and said quietly, "No wonder they walked out." When the surviving Germans were transferred to a POW camp outside Cherbourg, American psychologists interviewed them separately. The results startled everyone. Nearly all reported the same recurring dream, walking endlessly through mist, hearing voices calling their names. One sergeant insisted that during the final week he saw men who had died at Omaha guiding him through the fog. Another claimed that his commander's last order had been not to attack, but to disappear. The transcripts circulated briefly before being classified. Command feared the reports might spread panic or superstition among troops still fighting in France. Yet among Allied ranks, stories already spread. Infantrymen passing through the ruins of Saint-Lô spoke of encountering empty trenches still lined with rifles, helmets placed neatly on parapets, as if their owners had stepped away moments before. An American engineer wrote in a letter home, "It's the strangest thing. We walk through their lines and it feels like someone is still there watching, like the division dissolved but didn't leave." He ended the letter with a single line, "Maybe ghosts can surrender too." Back in Paris, captured documents confirmed the nightmare. German situation maps from late July showed the 352nd's front marked in pencil, then abruptly crossed out, replaced with the word unbekannt, unknown. Field Marshal von Kluge demanded an explanation. None came. By the time the Wehrmacht compiled its next order of battle, the 352nd had been erased entirely. No official disbandment, no transfer, just a blank line where thousands of names had once been. To the German war machine, it was as if the division had never existed. The American report on the surrender was forwarded to SHAEF headquarters. Eisenhower read it with quiet fascination. "In war," he said to Bradley, "men die for reasons they'll never know. But to vanish? That's new," Bradley replied. "Maybe that's what happens when belief runs out." Eisenhower nodded slowly. Then perhaps belief was Hitler's last weapon, and it finally failed. As autumn 1944 settled over Normandy, the land began to heal. Grass grew through shell craters, orchards budded again, but farmers still found relics of the 352nd, letters, helmets, bones, scattered like whispers in the soil. Local children called one field Das Geisterfeld, the ghost field. They said at night you could hear boots marching in the fog, and sometimes faintly the rattle of an empty machine gun firing at nothing. Even Allied veterans avoided camping there. "You don't sleep well where an army disappeared," one said years later. In December, as winter closed in, British intelligence compiled its final report. The conclusion was stark. Subject formation, 352nd Infantry Division, ceased effective existence through cumulative loss of cohesion, communication, and command. Psychological factors aggravated by continuous bombardment led to spontaneous dissolution. In plain terms, they lost their minds before they lost the battle. The analysts gave it a term, phantom collapse syndrome. It would later shape NATO's understanding of battlefield morale for decades. But for the men who had seen the white flag rise from the mist, those words were meaningless. They'd witnessed something that felt beyond explanation, as if the war itself had swallowed its own reflection. A year later, in 1945, when victory finally came, Captain Merrill visited the orchard again. The barn where Bruckner's men had waited was empty now, the roof half fallen. He walked the same muddy path, tracing footprints long since washed away. In the grass he found a piece of wood, the broken shaft of the flagpole. The fabric was gone, but a few white threads still clung to it. He kept it. Years later, he told a journalist, "It wasn't their surrender that haunted me. It was how quiet it was. No shouting, no crying. Just the sound of boots in mud. I think that's when I realized the war could end not with explosions, but with silence." Decades passed. Historians would argue endlessly about what really happened to the 352nd. Some blamed chaos, others desertion. A few suggested deliberate sabotage, that German officers ordered the division to scatter to slow Allied pursuit. But the official record remains unchanged. On paper, the 352nd Infantry Division ceased to exist between July 29th and August 1st, 1944. No exact coordinates, no last stand, only a note in the Wehrmacht's archive. Unit unaccounted for. Presumed destroyed by ghosts. When autumn swept across Normandy, the front had long since moved east. But in the headquarters tents of Allied intelligence, the 352nd would not stay buried. Files kept reappearing. Radio logs, diaries, intercepted German transmissions, threads from a division that officially did not exist. And somewhere between the static and the silence, investigators began to hear whispers that chilled even the skeptics. Major Harold Longworth sat hunched over a field receiver in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Caen. The rain tapped the windows like code. A British corporal adjusted the dials, frowning. "There it is again, sir," he said, a faint signal repeating on a loop. Short bursts. Then, "Wir sind noch hier." Longworth translated aloud. "We are still here." The corporal looked uneasy. But that frequency, it's been silent since July. They traced the signal to a valley west of St. Lo, the same ground where the 302nd had vanished. The area was supposed to be clear, but patrols sent there reported strange findings. Campfires recently extinguished, fresh footprints, German rations only weeks old. Yet no sign of the men themselves. Longworth ordered a night patrol. 2 jeeps, 10 men. They left at dusk. By dawn, only 8 returned. One of the missing was Sergeant Tom Evans, the radio operator. His partner, Corporal Reeves, could barely speak when they pulled him from the jeep. "They were calling him," he whispered. Voices in German and English. In the fog. Longworth dismissed it as nerves, until the recovered radio set began transmitting by itself that afternoon. No operator, no battery. Just a thin hiss, then the same phrase again. "Wir sind noch hier." The intelligence section logged it as unexplained atmospheric interference. But privately, Longworth couldn't shake the feeling that something had lingered in those fields, something left behind when belief and command dissolved. He ordered the area cordoned off and brought in a linguist. Captain Margaret Haynes, a quiet, sharp-eyed woman fluent in German dialects. She analyzed the recording frame by frame. "It's not a broadcast," she said finally. "It's a playback, an echo of an earlier transmission. The same phrase repeated with interference from artillery frequencies. Could it be natural feedback? Longworth asked. Haynes hesitated. Maybe. Or maybe someone left the transmitter looping, a kind of mechanical ghost. She looked at him. Major, you realize what this means? They didn't vanish all at once. Someone stayed behind to keep sending. Determined to find proof, Longworth and Haynes returned to the valley with a small team. The hedgerows were bare now, skeletal under the November frost. They followed the radio signal to a sunken lane bordered by ruined apple trees. There, half buried in the mud, lay a field transmitter still wired to a rusted battery. Inside the casing was a slip of paper wrapped in oilcloth. On it, written in cramped script, "If you hear this, we are gone. Do not look for us. We march where orders cannot follow." The signature was a name Longworth recognized, Late Gerber, the same officer whose diary they had recovered weeks earlier. The discovery made the hairs on his neck stand up. Gerber had written that he felt, "Orders come from nowhere." Now it seemed he had become the last voice of the division. Back in Caen, Haynes pieced together fragments from other sources. Letters intercepted from German field posts, fragments of codebooks, even Red Cross reports. A pattern emerged. In the division's final days, isolated pockets had begun receiving phantom orders, typed, signed, and stamped, but with no originating unit. The signatures didn't match any living officer. Some were from men confirmed killed months earlier in Russia. The orders all said the same thing: hold your ground. Reinforcements are coming, except no reinforcements ever came. When Allied analysts reconstructed the message chains, they discovered something horrifying. The orders weren't intercepted transmissions. They had been forged inside the division, passed down manually by desperate adjutants who refused to believe they'd been abandoned. The 352nd hadn't just lost contact. It had begun inventing it, Haynes wrote in her report. The division's command structure imploded inward. To maintain the illusion of control, officers fabricated orders citing non-existent higher commands. The men obeyed ghosts of their own making. When Longworth read it, he felt a chill deeper than any cold he'd known on the front. So they didn't vanish, he said. They followed voices they created themselves. Until belief ran out, Haynes answered. The next breakthrough came from captured German archives near Falaise, a crate of personal effects recovered from retreating units. Among them was a wax cylinder labeled Funkübung 352, a test recording. Haynes threaded it onto a portable phonograph. Static, then a burst of marching boot, followed by a calm male voice reciting coordinates and unit designations. At first it sounded routine. Then the voice repeated itself slower each time until it dissolved into heavy breathing. In the background, faintly, came the sound of artillery and distant screaming. When the cylinder ended, no one in the room spoke. Longworth finally said, "Burn it." Haynes shook her head. "No, file it. History will never believe this unless it listens." In December, Schaff ordered all investigation into the 352nd closed. Official reasoning: no further intelligence value. Unofficially, the reports unsettled command morale. The war was entering its bloodiest winter. No one wanted tales of phantom units haunting the rear, but Longworth couldn't let it go. He kept a copy of every report in a leather satchel, along with the slip from the transmitter. Years later, when asked why, he said, "Because I wanted to remember that even truth can dissolve under enough shell fire." Meanwhile, fragments of the 352nd continued surfacing across France. Isolated soldiers emerged from woods months after the front moved east, ragged, half-starved, their minds elsewhere. One was found near Mortain in April 1945, muttering that his unit was still holding Omaha. When shown a map proving the war had moved hundreds of miles east, he laughed until he cried. Another was captured in Belgium, insisting he'd received fresh orders from General Kreis, dead since July. Psychiatrists described a shared delusion, a lingering pocket of obedience to a command structure that no longer existed. Soldiers who could not stop fighting because they no longer knew how to stop being soldiers. After the war, British historian Dr. Alan Rutherford obtained access to the sealed 352nd file. His 1952 report, The Cohesion Paradox, included a chilling passage. When a military unit loses communication, identity fractures. Yet the 352nd reveals the opposite. a unity so absolute it transcended logic. They obeyed orders no one gave, heard voices no one spoke, and marched until nothing remained but the echo of command itself. He concluded, almost reluctantly, perhaps the true weapon of modern war is faith, and the moment it breaks, men vanish. That same year, a French farmer plowing his land near Bayeux unearthed a tin box containing photographs, blurred, ghostly images of soldiers moving through mist. Experts dated the film to late July 1944. One frame showed a group of men standing in an orchard facing away from the camera, rifles slung as if waiting for something. Another captured a single figure, helmet off, face turned toward the lens, half smiling, half afraid. The negatives were badly corroded, but when enlarged, faint words appeared scratched into the edge of one frame. Wir folgen den Stimmen. We follow the voices. The farmer handed the box to local authorities. It was never seen again. By the late 1950s, the tale of the Ghost Division had become military folklore. Veterans traded stories in bars. How the 352nd haunted the hedgerows. How radios crackled with dead frequencies. How on misty nights you could still hear German boots marching in sync. Most historians dismissed it as superstition, but a few who had served in Normandy avoided the topic altogether. One American colonel asked about it in a documentary interview, paused before answering. I don't know what happened to them, he said softly, but I do know this, when you spend long enough in that fog you start hearing things too. He lit a cigarette, exhaled and whispered, maybe they didn't die. Maybe they just forgot how to be alive. In 1971, during renovations at the British War Office, a locked drawer was discovered in a disused cabinet. Inside were carbon copies of Longworth's original reports and Haynes's transcripts. On top lay a sealed envelope marked, "Return to intelligence and do not release." Inside was the wax cylinder, its label faded but intact. Next to it, in Longworth's handwriting, a note. For the record, the 352nd spoke once more in 1947, a transmission on their old frequency. Only one phrase. He had written it in English beneath the German, "We are still here." The cylinder was never played again. It sits today sealed in the Imperial War Museum's deep archives, catalogued simply as Funkübung 352, unverified. Few curators know what it is. Fewer still want to. Because some nights when the museum is empty and the temperature drops, guards swear they hear faint static from the storage wing, a whisper beneath the hum of the lights. They say it sounds like a man counting coordinates in German, and sometimes, between the numbers, a voice says quietly, "Wir sind noch hier." Berlin, 1948. The city was a corpse. Its streets still smelled of smoke and ash. Its buildings stood like broken teeth. Amid the ruins, Allied investigators dug through what remained of the Reich's military archives, looking for the ghosts that refused to die. One of them was Dr. Henry Wallace, a British psychologist attached to the Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. He specialized in what he called psychological contagion, the invisible warfare of belief and rumor that could undo an army faster than bullets. The file on the 352nd Infantry Division landed on his desk in a crate, labeled Anomalous Behavior Reports. Wallace opened it expecting hysteria, but what he found were meticulously detailed field notes, interrogation records, and radio transcripts from Longworth and Haynes, the missing major and his linguist. He read the last line of Haynes's report 3 times. The division obeyed voices of its own making. That night, Wallace couldn't sleep. He kept hearing the phrase, "We are still here," in the slow rhythm of his own breathing. 2 months later, Wallace flew to Munich to interview former Wehrmacht psychiatrists interned by the Allies. Among them was Dr. Friedrich Kappel, a medical officer once attached to the 352nd's headquarters. The man was frail, his eyes sunken, hands shaking from age or guilt. When Wallace entered the cell, Kappel greeted him in accented English. "You've come about the ghosts," he said before the interpreter could speak. Wallace blinked. "You know that term?" Kappel smiled thinly. Everyone knew. The ghosts of Omaha. That's what the men called themselves at the end. He leaned closer, voice low. But they were made that way. We built them. Through the hours that followed, Kappel spoke like a man confessing a sin to history itself. He claimed that in late 1943, the Wehrmacht's psychological warfare branch, Abteilung 7, had begun experiments in what they called akustische Moralverstärkung, acoustic morale enhancement. The idea was simple and monstrous: use pre-recorded commands and simulated radio traffic to maintain discipline among isolated units cut off from command. They believed a voice on the radio could hold a regiment together longer than food or ammunition, Capel said. Even a dead commander can still give orders if his voice remains. According to Capel, his unit had tested the method briefly in Russia, but the first large-scale deployment was in Normandy, under the 352nd. They had recorded the voice of General Kreis himself, reading generic commands and encouragement. When the division's lines broke, hidden transmitters replayed these messages in a random loop, making it seem as if headquarters still operated. It worked too well, Capel whispered. When Kreis died, they kept hearing him. Wallace leaned back, heart pounding. You're saying the division thought they were receiving orders from a dead man? Capel nodded slowly. Yes, and when the tapes ran out, they made their own. The revelation hit like an artillery blast. The voices weren't spectral, and at least not at first. They were remnants of a propaganda experiment gone rogue. But something darker had followed. Capel described how, as the siege worsened, the men began recording each other's voices. Fragments of orders, prayers, screams, splicing them into endless loops. It became a ritual, he said. They no longer cared who was speaking, only that someone was. Wallace felt a shiver creep through him. What happened when the Americans broke through? Capel's eyes glazed over. Silence. Real silence. That's when they began to vanish. In his report to London, Wallace wrote, the so-called Ghost Division appears to have been the first case of artificial command persistence, a self-sustaining illusion of hierarchy. The voices began as tools of control, but became a form of collective possession. He proposed a theory. The men of the 352nd, starved of orders and trapped in chaos, clung to the only constant, the voice of authority, even if it was dead. When the tapes ceased, they internalized it. The echo moved from the airwaves into their minds. Wallace coined a term that would later echo through Cold War research: cognitive loop conditioning. Months later, he received word that another witness had been located, Oberleutnant Victor Rehmer, once an adjutant to the 352nd staff. Rehmer was living under a false name in a displaced persons camp near Bremen. Wallace traveled there in February 1949. The camp was a maze of frozen mud and makeshift huts, full of people trying to forget who they'd been. Rehmer looked more like a ghost than a man. His hair had turned white, though he was barely 40. When Wallace introduced himself, Rehmer only nodded, eyes unfocused. I know why you're here, he murmured. You've heard them too, haven't you? Wallace tried to maintain composure. Heard what? The voices. They never stopped. Sometimes at night, when the wind passes through the wires, you can still hear the general. Rehmer smiled weakly. He says, stand fast. Always stand fast. Wallace recorded their conversation in full. It remains one of the most disturbing testimonies in any WWII archive. Rehmer described the last days near St. Lo. We had no contact, no fuel, no food. But the radio still spoke. We thought Kreis had found a way to reach us. We obeyed. Even when the voices stopped, we still heard them. They were inside now, inside all of us. He paused, trembling. When the fog came, we followed the sound. It led us into the orchards. We walked until we saw the Americans. Then the sound stopped. When Wallace asked why they surrendered instead of fighting, Rehmer said quietly, because the voice told us, it is finished. After that interview, Wallace never fully recovered. His superiors dismissed the findings as post-traumatic distortion. But in private correspondence with MI5, he insisted the experiment had created a phenomenon of mass psychological imprinting, soldiers conditioned to respond to command frequencies long after the command itself had died. He ended one letter with a single line. The division was not destroyed by fear. It was absorbed by its own echo. In the early 1950s, similar patterns began appearing in Soviet prisoner debriefings. Russian intelligence officers reported German POWs who claimed to hear their officers' voices during interrogation. One Soviet psychologist noted, they appear to respond to non-existent radio prompts, suggest residual conditioning. Western agencies took notice. The British Defense Research Bureau classified Wallace's files under the code name Operation Resonance. The Americans created a parallel study, Project Echo Chamber, to investigate auditory command reinforcement in combat units. None of it reached the public. The Cold War had begun, and psychological warfare was now the most valuable weapon of all. In 1956, Wallace was invited to a NATO conference in Brussels. During his presentation, he played a restored recording of one of the 352nd's field tapes. The room of officers listened in uneasy silence as a faint, distorted voice barked, "Halten Sie die Linie, stand fast, do not yield." The sound faded into static. Then came another voice, softer, almost human, a soldier whispering, "Wir hören dich, Herr General. We hear you." General, a French colonel, stood up and left the room. After the playback, no one spoke for a long time. Then the chairman simply said, "Let us never repeat this." The tapes were sealed again. Wallace retired in 1962. He rarely spoke of the war, except in one unpublished essay found after his death. In it, he wrote, "When men are taught to obey without question, the voice becomes immortal. It survives the flesh. The 352nd proved that even in death, command can persist. Perhaps that is the true curse of modern war, the inability to stop hearing the orders." He ended with a question scrawled in the margin. If obedience can outlive the officer, can war itself ever die? In 1974, the German government quietly declassified a small number of surviving documents from Abteilung 7. Among them were schematics for portable morale transmitters, designed for frontline deployment. One blueprint bore a handwritten note, "Prototype tested 352nd Infantry Div. Normandy, June 1944, effective range 5 km. At the bottom, a signature barely legible through the smudge of age, Dr. F. Capel. The discovery reignited interest among historians, but the British archives refused to release Wallace's reports. The files remained sealed under national security restrictions, with the next review date set for 2049. When asked about them in a 1980 documentary, a former intelligence officer smiled faintly and said, "Some truths aren't buried, and they hum." In Normandy, the locals never forgot. Farmers still found pieces of old radio wire coiled around fence posts, the copper green with corrosion. Sometimes after heavy rain, the soil unearthed fragments of headphones, microphone shards, and lengths of magnetic tape that crumbled at the touch. One elderly villager told a journalist, "When the wind blows from the sea, you can hear voices in the hedgerows. German, tired, always the same words." He paused, eyes distant, stand fast. And so the 352nd remained, not as men, not even as soldiers, but as echoes of an experiment meant to keep them loyal. The war had ended, but its command never had. The division that vanished on paper lived on in frequency, invisible, endless, waiting. The year was 1998. Deep beneath Brussels, in a NATO communications archive known as Section Echo 9, a young technician named Martin Devereaux was digitizing thousands of decaying analog tapes. The project had been routine until one night, when a plain gray reel arrived with no metadata, just a faded tag, 352 INF, Div, Falaise, Sector au Aoug, 1944. The tape hissed as it spun. At first, it was nothing, static, a heartbeat of silence, then faint wind. Martin nearly stopped it. But then a voice emerged, distant and broken, reciting coordinates in German. He leaned closer. The voice repeated the numbers, slower, trembling, as though underwater. Then came a second voice, fainter still. "Wir hören dich, Herr General." Martin froze. He'd heard the same words once before, in a training lecture about psychological anomalies in WWII signal records. The Ghost Division. The 352nd, he checked the recording log. The coordinates being read out were not random. They formed a straight line, one that pointed not to Normandy but east toward Berlin. He played it again. This time, after the coordinates ended, a new voice, softer, human, almost pleading, whispered, "Es ist genug." It is enough. Then the tape went silent. Martin reported the anomaly to his superior. Within 24 hours, the reel was confiscated by NATO intelligence. The incident was classified as signal contamination, probable hoax. But before they took it, Martin had already copied a fragment onto a personal cassette. He would listen to it for years, trying to understand. The rediscovery of that reel reignited dormant files across Europe. By 2001, historians revisited Operation Resonance, Wallace's post-war research, and the testimonies of Kappel and Raymer. But something new had emerged, a pattern linking unexplained. Radio bursts along the French coast to atmospheric phenomena, matching the old acoustische transmitters. 1. Report described low-frequency echoes recurring every June 6 between 0400 and 600 hours, faintly modulated, consistent with 1940s broadcast equipment. In other words, the 352nd was still transmitting. That summer, a BBC documentary crew obtained permission to record near St. Lo. Their sound engineer, a veteran named Thomas Elridge, carried a portable receiver tuned to the 42-46 MHz band, the same range used by German field radios. At 4:17 a.m., as dawn crept across the valley, the receiver crackled. A man's voice spoke in German, distant, irregular, as though climbing through layers of air and time. Higher. 352. Linie halten. Keine Rückkehr. Then silence. Elridge's translator went pale. He said, and this is 352, hold the line. There is no return. The recording later vanished from BBC archives, but Elridge kept a personal copy. He swore under oath that no transmitter was active in a 30-mile radius. The British Ministry of Defense issued a statement calling the incident meteorological interference. That same year, an independent historian, Dr. Lucy Wallace, granddaughter of Henry Wallace, began writing a book titled The Division That Wouldn't Die. Using her grandfather's sealed notes, she reconstructed the psychological experiments that had trapped the 352nd in a loop of obedience. But while researching in the Imperial War Museum, she uncovered something her grandfather had never seen. A sealed envelope inside his files, marked only with a date, 6th of June 1944. Inside was a fragment of paper with a single line typed in German, "Signal will continue until acknowledged." No signature. No origin. She realized with horror that this was not an order from the 352nd, but to them. Someone had activated the broadcast before the invasion even began. The deeper Lucy dug, the stranger it grew. She traced the origins of the transmitters to a facility near Bremen, an SS-operated communications lab called Stützpunkt Eule, Owl Station. It had been destroyed by Allied bombing, but fragments of its records survived. They referred to an experimental system codenamed Nachklang, aftertone. Its stated purpose: to ensure continuity of command through remote auditory reinforcement beyond the threshold of human endurance. It used layered frequencies designed to resonate with the human brainstem, the same technique later studied in early Cold War mind control experiments. The target: prototype 352nd Infantry Division, Omaha Sector. Lucy wrote in her notes, "They built the perfect soldiers, ones who would never stop obeying, even after death." When she published her findings, the book was heavily redacted by publishers under national security advisement. Entire pages were blanked. The remaining text ended abruptly with a quote from her grandfather. "Perhaps the war never ended. Perhaps it continues wherever men still hear orders." She died in 2011, 6 months before the declassification review that might have proven her right. Today, the 352nd exists only as shadow, a line of names etched into German memorials and entry in military archives. But in Normandy, their legend breathes through the fog. Farmers still claim their radios hum with old German commands during June storms. Hikers near the St. Lo Valley hear footsteps in the hedgerows measured, synchronized, the sound of marching that fades when you turn. Local folklore calls it Die letzte Wache, the last watch. An old shepherd who fought as a boy in the French resistance once said to a journalist, "They're not haunting us. They're still waiting for the order to stand down." In 2015, NATO quietly transferred all surviving tapes from Operation Resonance to a secure digital archive under Vault Echo 3. Access remains restricted, but leaked internal memos describe one particular file: Signal 352 final.wave. It was decoded using modern software to reveal embedded harmonics undetectable by 1940s equipment. Within those frequencies lay a final transmission, layered, faint, human. After months of spectral analysis, linguists confirmed the words, "We have stood long enough. Permission to rest, and after that, silence. Permanent silence." When the technicians realized what they were hearing, some wept. Others refused to listen again. One engineer wrote in his log, "It felt like a prayer, not a message." The waveform was archived under a new classification, resonance concluded. No further activity was ever detected on the 352nd's old frequencies. But every June, just before dawn, a few amateur radio operators in Normandy still gather on the cliffs above Omaha Beach. They tune to the old band, headphones pressed tight listening to the static. One of them, a retired signalman named Bernard Lefebvre, claims that in 2019, he caught something faint beneath the noise. Not words, not commands, just breathing, as if someone somewhere was finally exhaling. History books tell us the 352nd Infantry Division was annihilated in Normandy. But the men who found that orchard, who saw the white flag rise in the rain, knew otherwise. The division didn't die. It dissolved. It lingered, echoing through wires, through memory, through obedience itself. And when at last the voices fell quiet, what remained was not defeat, but release. The silence after 50 years was not emptiness. It was mercy. All wars end twice, and once in the world and once in the minds of those who fought them. H. Wallace, 1958, the screen fades to black. Then faintly, almost too soft to hear, "Es ist genug, it is enough."